Hello and welcome to the GovInsider Live Festival of Innovation, where we bring you brilliant global government innovators from across the world. I'm Joshua Chambers, the founder of GovInsider, and this session is called Understanding Complexity. And I'm incredibly excited about this session. I've been looking forward to it all week. We have a stellar lineup of brilliant innovators joining us for the next hour. From Singapore, we have Maniam, Deputy Secretary of Industry and Information at Singapore's Ministry of Communications and Information. From the OECD, we have Piret, Tonurist, who is the innovation lead at this fantastic global organization. And from Germany, we have the founder of the Bundeswehr Cyber Innovation Hub and a brilliant innovator with a long track record in the private sector, Marcel, Otto. Jon, welcome to our guests. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And I'm going to go straight into our first presentation, or at least conversation, and that's with my friend Aaron. So Aaron, over to you.
Thanks so much, Josh. Thanks to you and the team for having me. And, this is one of my favorite topics in the world, to be honest, just understanding complexity, right? Thinking about the issues out there and how so many of them move beyond the linear and more mechanistic approaches that are amenable to or at least that are familiar to us in what we've done in public policy before. And I like to boil down complexity to one thing. It's situations where we are not clear about the cause and effect relationships at work in a situation. Let me say that again, right? Situations where we're not clear about cause and effect relationships. In some instances, we are clear. We know that if we carry something and we drop it, gravity causes it to fall. We know that if we hit ourselves somewhere, the cause and effect relationships are such that it will hurt. But there are lots of issues where the cause and effect relationships are not that clear. And I think those are the ones that provide the most interesting puzzles for us in the public policy realm. Now, what I like to think of is that there are three types of complexity out there, right? Three ways in which an issue can be complex and in which these cause and effect relationships can play out in very subtle and very nuanced ways. The first of these is what I like to call social complexity. And these are situations where my definition of a problem and its solutions might be very different from another person's, right? So different stakeholders have different views on what exactly is at work, and therefore there is a complexity in defining the nature of the causes and effects and whether those things are beneficial. One example of this is things like environmental issues, where for a business, taking certain economic action might be a really good thing, right? It generates growth, it generates jobs, it generates economic value for a community. But there might be pollution effects, there might be other more subtle, intangible effects on parts of a community that we don't always see. And as a whole, therefore, we find that the problem definition is itself difficult to do. And because of that, we can't actually identify whether the causes lead to positive or negative effects, right? We call this social complexity because in social interactions, there are differences in how problems get defined, and therefore there are differences in how the estimation of the effects of those problems might actually get played out. That's the first type of complexity that exists. The second kind of complexity that I think is at play in lots of public policy issues is what we call dynamic complexity. And dynamic complexity is a situation where the cause might be felt today or at a certain point in time, but the full effects of that cause are only played out much later in time. Now, one good example of this is demographic issues. Governments may try and intervene in their populations today, right? They might try to control births, they might try to encourage fertility, they might try to do things that make the lives of aging populations better. And the full effects of this are only felt many, many years down the road. That is why when countries try to control their populations through active interventions, what they often find is situations where they have lots of unanticipated effects because those effects happen in a much later time frame than where they originally thought they would feel them. Singapore actually went through this many years ago. We had a policy called Stop at 2, right, which we put into place in the 60s and 70s because we wanted to arrest a burgeoning population. We weren't sure whether the carrying capacity of the country could cope with that level of population growth. And what we're facing now is some of the long tail effects of that initial set of policies, because we've had to reverse that and actually encourage people to have more children rather than stop at 2. Why? Because we found that our total fertility rate at this stage is actually falling, and we would like for that levels to go up, because that would allow us to actually have more folks coming into the economy and allow us really to have more of a domestic balance in our overall manpower situation. So that's dynamic complexity, right? Where the cause is activated in one particular point in time, but the effects of it are only felt at a much later point. There is a third kind of complexity, and that's what we call generative complexity. And generative complexity is an interesting thing, because really what it refers to is a phenomenon called emergence, right? Where you can have the same rough set of causes at work in different places, but when you put them together, you find that actually they result in very, very different outcomes. The COVID-19 situation is actually a really good example of this, because all countries are experiencing the pandemic, right? But the mix of that pandemic with local factors, with local cultural factors, local geographies, is resulting in very, very different outcomes, because the minor differences that exist between these places actually causes quite significant, large differences in overall consequences. So you see a situation in Singapore, for instance, where when you have a dense urban population, the outcomes of a pandemic are different, for instance, from a place like New Zealand, where the population is a lot more spread out, where there's more space across 2 islands and not a tiny space like Singapore's is. And then there are differences between that and what's going on in Australia or in China or in the USA, right? Where the same sets of causes produce very different outcomes because they are at play with very different sets of local circumstances and local situations. Now, this is interesting because what it means is that the initial identification of causes is never enough for us to predict what exactly might happen in the medium or even the longer term. And what we have, therefore, is a situation where we see outcomes emerging, hence the term emergence, right? Rather than any kind of stable equilibrium that we can predict with great certainty, great accuracy, and great precision. So that's 3 types of complexity that I've mentioned, right? Social complexity, where we define problems in different ways. Dynamic complexity, where the effects at one time are only, or rather where the causes of a problem are felt at one time, but the effects of those causes are only manifested at a much later stage. And then finally, generative complexity, where seemingly similar circumstances can lead to very different outcomes because of minor differences, minor perturbations amongst them. The big question, of course, at this stage is what can we do about complexity? After we've understood it and know that it can be social or dynamic or generative in its elements, or maybe some combination of those 3, what can we do about complex situations? And I like to think of one thing in particular, right? We have to move away from the idea that there are stable equilibria out there. There are no stable situations where there's no tendency to change, which is what an equilibrium is. Rather, what we need to get used to is the fact that the world is turbulent. We need to be agile in it. And the best way to be agile is to constantly experiment and iterate with our public policy means and programs and events. What do I mean by that? Rather than think that we can enact a certain set of policies and then simply expect them to play out in a stable and predictable way, what we do need to have is an experimental mindset. We need to try small-scale tests, prototypes, right? Beta versions of policies. We need to go through simulations. And once we've understood the world in those small-scale tests and simulations, then what we can allow ourselves to do is to use those experiments to probe the world, right? Use those experiments to get data about the actual implementation of these ideas. And then once we've probed and obtained that data, we can respond by tweaking our initial idea. We can adjust it, we can iterate and refine it, and then hopefully along the way, find that we actually get better in terms of the eventual ideas that we reach. Now, this is an important idea because experimentation and iteration are not natural in a lot of public policy situations. Many public policy makers or practitioners enjoy having very structured approaches to things. We like things like blueprints. We enjoy having things like, structured plans, work groups, working committees that are guided by strategic committees that have guiding committees and advisory committees on top of them. Now, those work for some kinds of very technical problems, but when we are faced with social or dynamic or generative complexity, what we need instead is a situation where we can constantly experiment, change the structures if we need to, iterate and refine them wherever possible. And if we do that, then I think we are in a much better position to address the kinds of complexities that exist out there, the subtleties and the nuances that exist in our public policy situations. Experiments also mean we need to be willing to fail, because half of the experiments we go through may not work out. And that's an important mindset too, because if we don't allow ourselves the space to fail, then we don't actually allow ourselves to learn from those failures. And the key, of course, is to make sure that we fail in the most meaningful ways, right? That we fail where there is actual complexity and not simply because we've been complacent about the situations that we're in. We need to allow ourselves to fail small and fail fast via the prototypes and the beta versions that I mentioned, so that in the longer term, we can keep refining the policy outcomes that we've got. I'm nearly at the end of my 10 minutes, so I just wanted to stress that when we're faced with these situations of complexity, what we need is a situation, is responses where we experiment and iterate and adopt essentially unordered approaches, right? Rather than trying to structure things in an overly mechanistic or rigid way. I'm looking forward very much to the questions and responses or comments that might come in, and I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks very much, Josh.
Fantastic. Normally it's me telling other people that they have to unmute, but I did it myself this time. I don't believe it. Anyway, fantastic. Thank you so much for an incredible presentation. There's a huge amount of depth there, and I'm really looking forward to asking you some specifics about it in the Q&A. I'll also note to people who are watching on both Facebook Live and YouTube Live, if you put a question in the comments, we can in fact bring it up on screen and put it to our panelists as well. So feel free to do so if you're in that mood. And now I'm going to turn to our next speaker. It's my friend Marcel Otto Jon, who, as I noted at the beginning, founded the Bundeswehr Cyber Innovation Hub, where, amongst other things, the soldiers were skateboarding on longboards around the office. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the longboards, but also about the brilliant innovations as well that you brought to that very traditional, structured German military.
Thank you very much,
Over to
Joshua.
you.
So, complexity in the government, in the public sector, and how we deal with it. And I would say there are really two things that would help us a lot dealing better with complexity in the public sector. It's a shift to agile culture, and it's much more diversity in the teams, in particular in the leadership teams. But I'm here today to speak about a very special aspect, which is the experience from creating a so-called digital innovation unit, or some may call it a venturing unit, corporate venturing unit. So, which really is what Bundeswehr Cyber Innovation Hub is about. And so, what is a digital innovation unit? It's a place either in a corporate or in a public sector ministry or organization where there is a different atmosphere around entrepreneurship. It's characterized by entrepreneurship. It's characterized by wanting to cooperate with the startup ecosystem, and it has to do with building new things, new business models, new organizations, new capabilities. So in the context of transformation, in the context of learning new ways how to collaborate, this is only one aspect, which I think is important to point out. And so what do we do at Bundeswehr? We created this digital innovation unit from scratch, because starting this, there's always an improve or build from scratch decision to be done. So we decided to build it from scratch. And the mission was to accelerate innovation to our soldiers, really to bring into the hands of the operator innovations enabled by digital technology. But we'll come back to that in a moment, because it always goes along with a business model innovation, I should say. So the vision really was that within the complexity of the public sector, we would be able to create one unit that could build new capabilities at the heartbeat of the best startups, And it's important to point out that we're talking about the best startups as role model, because it may come as a surprise to some, but at least half the startups are below average, so are not necessarily the best role models. And so what was the activity spectrum? It was really three things. It was learning how to collaborate with the startup ecosystem, i.e. procuring from startups at a global level, internationally, but also collaborating, creating partnerships, being really in the sharing economy mindset, which is very difficult from the military, which comes from a place which is very secretive and very closed shop. The second activity is which we called building a lean startup as a military capability. That means creating a place where you can build new products. And it's important to understand that although the military always is a place which is highly innovative, it's not necessarily a place which what we would call in the startup ecosystem a good product owner, and particularly not in the agile kind of way of developing products. And the third activity was about to empower bottom-up innovation. So we created, for example, an accelerator for not for external innovators, but for our own employees, for our soldiers, and to enable them to become innovators and public entrepreneurs. And so let me also point out a couple of key aspects of the operating model. So one interesting thing is we conceived it as a do tank, as we called it. So everything we did, although there was a longer term vision to change the way we operate and to introduce a new way of operation, we did this with very specific projects. So it was a very strong project focus. And a characteristic was that in every project we would work with the customer. The customer for us was not the strategic capabilities or some other HQ function that would normally determine what the military needs, but was really the troops, the platoon, the battalion, those who are really the operators. And so there was never a project without this customer involved. And one of the very important aspects of the operational model was to say it's better to work with the user than for the user. So the second one was the setup of the team. We created a team that was composed of 50% from the system, i.e. soldiers, some civilian employees, but mostly soldiers, predominantly from the cyber and special forces area, and Air Force, and but all divisions. And 50% came from the startup ecosystem. So we had quite a few serial entrepreneurs and other digital change makers from the ecosystem. A third aspect of the operational model was the cross-functional team. So we tried to implement within the unit all the expertise required. So there could be an IT security expert, it could be legal expertise in procurement law, in public financing law, in all these things. So every expertise that is needed in the unit, and which again is very untypical for the public sector and the military in particular, is budget control. So typically other people will decide over your budget. So in this case, we granted the rights to the unit to spend their own money. And the last aspect, which should not be underestimated, I think, was an emphasis from day one on communication. Because everybody speaks about the fact that transformation is a communication exercise, but really it's always an underestimated challenge. So we created from day one a team that would organize many events, many evangelization things, but also many co-creation events. And which I personally find the most important aspect, we tried to build a community of change makers within the system, where sort of every soldier could participate with very easily and be in direct touch with the unit, which again, is very untypical in a system that works by a chain of command. Now, to summarize, I thought a lot about what are the key lessons learned I can share with you. And so I decided to point out maybe 3 things. And these are lessons learned which are mirrored by other innovation units around the world. Over the last 4 years, I analyzed probably 50 innovation units, both from the military and public sector and in large organizations. And it seems that the experiences are very, very similar across the board. So the number one important strategic question to be addressed is the mission of this digital innovation unit to work in the box or out of the box? By which I mean, there's always something like a corporate strategy, an overall strategy with the key focus. The question is, to what degree should an innovation unit be limited to operating within that strategy? And it's an important question because there's several extremes here. And we came to this saying, we crafted it to say, out of the box with consent is in the box. So whatever the strategic purpose is, the strategic mission is, I think the important thing is not to make it dependent on the system in forms of requirements for other people, other divisions to approve any innovation project, but it should be really reporting to the minister, to the CEO, to the senior leadership, and it can be within a given strategy, but don't let other people in the system to decide whether it's in the strategy or not. The second lesson learned is the question of handing over of projects. So there seems to be this idea across all innovation units and across their motherships that the task of the innovation unit would be to identify ideas and initiate a project, validate it, and then pass over the project as soon as possible to the core system. And we found out that this doesn't work, or to put it in a different word, it is always handed over too early. Now remember, the true value comes not from incremental innovation, product innovation, but really comes from disruptive innovation. Now disruptive innovation, even if it's technology-based, almost always comes with a business model innovation. And it's very hard to give over a new idea, a new way of operating to the existing system that are used to operate in a certain way. It's just not working. And the third lesson learned is there are no synergies with the core organization. I mean, no, nada, rien du tout. There is, people tend to think that the innovation unit could rely on headquarter functions like finance, legal services, personnel, or other. And the truth is, whenever you do that, you rely on central functions, you will harvest typical organization thinking. So if you want to make an innovation unit successful, it should be completely independent. And I would close by saying that I think the right way to think about an innovation unit is to think of a competitor. If it's not there to be a competitor to the existing system, then something is wrong. So it means it will create friction. It means it will create conflict. Hopefully it will be constructive conflict. But I think that's one thing the public sector needs to wake up to. We always try to standardize everything, and everything the public sector tends to look for the right way and therefore tries to find the standard, when in reality there are different perspectives and different ways to do it. And so give the freedom to allow for conflict and for competition. And I would even say, if you're not capable of protecting your innovation unit from that competitive forces, then you may be better off outsourcing it to the private sector than running it within the government. Thank you. So I'm looking forward to the debate.
Oh, that was another brilliant presentation. My goodness me. Thank you so much. Wow, really taken aback by that. Fantastic. Thank you. And now straight into our third presentation. Piret, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. So it's great to actually hear from Aaron and Marcel, and I can take it from here from a kind of similar note, that governments face different types of complexity. And Aaron also told us a little bit about social, dynamic, and generative complexity, but there are other ways of also classifying. So we have actually gotten to know complexity pretty well. So we have an idea what complexity is all about. And what complexity tends to do is that it actually leads to uncertainty. And these different types of events that we don't want to have actually happening, or we want to have actually happening. So they can be both negative and positive. So I think everybody has heard a lot about black swans and different types of metaphors that we have been facing in the last crisis, but not only here, but elsewhere. So we have events that have huge impacts, but there are also kind of causes that lead to them that are sometimes unknown or uncontrollable, like Aaron also explained, that sometimes we don't know what causes an event to happen. And this is why complexity is such an important part of policymaking today. We actually have to contend and do something about it. What we tend to have going on at the moment is that there are a variety of responses and tools connected to complexity. So just think about COVID-19 crisis and the huge amount of different responses and ideas responding to different types of problems. Problems from tracking and tracing to even testing out basic income regimes that could actually give us insight into the world where most jobs will be automized, and we have to actually create new types of jobs in the upcoming years. So we can see these kind of experiments around very complex issues going on daily around the world. And what we see governments doing around the different worlds is that they have to actually work at different speeds at the same time. So if you are facing, for example, dynamic complexity or generative complexity, as Aaron classified, you have to be extremely reactive and adaptive because things are coming up and you may have also different types of kind of events or effects that you didn't see coming, so unintended effects. So you have to actually have a muscle to react and adapt very quickly. But there are also issues that we would like to be proactive about, to actually anticipate. We have to have a kind of a longer term view about the preferable future or futures that we want to not have happen. So we have to work in different speeds and in different ways at the same time. So be it reactive and proactive at the same time inside government as well. And both are needed. So we can't face different types of complexity while only thinking in futures, but we also have to have an arm to adapt to things that we couldn't have never seen coming, because there are also issues that come up and the types of complexities and adverse effects that are difficult or even impossible to foresee. So governments have to have both. And then we have to also do different innovations at the same time. We also have to innovate ourselves out of the complexity in different ways. So we have to not only keep options open and irreversible, so adapt to the changes that the complexity presents, but we also need to have futures-oriented innovations, so anticipatory innovations, to try these kind of future visions about what we want to see. So not only doing startups or experimentations or kind of agile type of things, but there also has to be a possibility to commit to larger scale transformations, but to be critical about it, to have those autonomous arms that are continuously questioning and taking on or competing with the general narratives that we have in place, that Marcel was talking about. The innovation unit that is aimed at transformation is always competing with the kind of general lines of business. So not only complexity, analyzing complexity, what we've actually become quite good at doing in governments today, but doing something about it, actually taking action towards that complexity. And that we see is one of the most difficult parts of all, because we tend to understand the complexity once things have happened. And when we're faced with a crisis and are tapped into it, there seems to be very little time to actually think about all the adverse effects or cascading effects that are upcoming. So in many ways, these crises and these complex problems become paralyzing. You want to simplify them and make them linear because they become easier to deal with. And that, I think, is one of the main problems that governments face today, is that we are unable to take this kind of anticipatory knowledge or future thinking ideas, but actually doing something or taking it into that kind of innovative practice, doing innovation around us. Actually having our labs testing out uncomfortable ideas around potential futures that are uncertain in nature. So giving the allowance in governments to do that. So the long road to transformation is paved with experimentation. So as also Aaron outlined, that governments need to experiment. But there is also a but, because we don't only want to stay experimenting and experimenting. We want to also create transformations, systems-wise transformations. We also sometimes want to kill off previous systems that have been logging on and not actually delivering for the results on how things have been moved on. So there also has to be kind of an arm to go from experiment to scaling up towards a transformative change within government as a wide, because otherwise governments tend to get comfortable with the experimentation logic and agile logic as well, because it allows them to be quite innovative in nature, so communicate that they are innovating and transforming, but not actually committing large-scale resources to transformative ideas that have been proven in experiments. So the question is, what happens when an experiment is done and it has shown that you should go ahead with the thing that you're doing? How to give that over, as Marcel talked about, giving over ideas from an innovation unit and when to do that and how to do that, or what needs to happen. If, for example, your previous organization that is built for other types of services or products is unable to actually deal with the type of innovation that you want to see in place in practice. So you also need to think about the different components of this transitional and transformative journeys within government. Not only about the agency of different innovative players around looking for alternative solutions, the organizational capacity and tools and methods around that, but also the authorizing environment around governments to legitimize ideas, to give autonomy to these units to think about that, but also how to give and use those ideas for transformation. So which kind of networks and partnerships you need to counter, which kind of vested interests and cognitive biases you need to tackle to make change happen when you're dealing with complexity, and how to keep that circle happening all the time, because policies are not going to be static, they're going to be dynamic in nature. We don't live the same way as our parents did 20 years ago, and certainly our children are not going to be in the same world that we live today. So managing innovation portfolios under complexity is a very interesting and interesting tasks, because you have to do different things for different types of complex problems, and you have to attack different types of uncertainty created by complexity in different ways. So how to go on from here? We are also very grateful for GovInsider for introducing this topic and getting these great speakers to explore those ideas. And we will also want to continue that discussion in our Government Aftershock event that is coming up in November, where we'll look more deeply into anticipatory innovation governance, starter kits for different public sector organizations, and how to also manage innovation portfolios in complex times. Thank you very much.
Very nice. Thank you very much. And I will be attending that event myself. I'm really looking forward to it as well. It is question time now. I'm going to attempt to grapple with the intellects that I have in front of me, but please feel free to question one another as well if you think I'm doing it all wrong. Piret, I want to start with a question for you because, of course, at OECD, you're advising governments right across the world. And one of the things that's been really interesting this week is we've had quite a few governments that in some ways have had to almost start from scratch after the fall of the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, of course, rebuilding structures. If you were building government today from scratch, what would be some considerations you would make to deal with complexity? How would you structure it to cope?
That's a very interesting question indeed. And I'm an Estonian by background, so I know for sure that we didn't start from scratch. So we had, I wonder what needs to happen. There needs to be a bomb or something to start from scratch, because one of the first things you have to actually do is deal with all the path dependency that have gone on before. I mean, Lithuania, Estonia, all the countries that started so-called from scratch had to actually kind of wade through the mire of all the institutions and capacities and, culture that had been built up over 50 years in the Soviet Union to do so. So, I mean, in this kind of utopian reality of where would I start if there would be nothing there before, I think that, I think that you also, in that kind of situations, you start with an agreement. What is government for? And that agreement doesn't have to be the same as government now. So maybe if, kind of future society where we can start from zero, we can also imagine an agreement for what we want the government to be that is different from now. So it would actually facilitate that conversation to begin with. And then we'll start to build maybe something totally different that we have in place today.
Very nice. We have a question that's come in on YouTube. We're going to bring it up. I'm going to put this one to Aaron. How can we strengthen the public sector's ability to understand and respond to complexity? What new skills and competencies, if that is indeed the best way to strengthen the ability, do you think we should inculcate? And that's from Kalissa Mann, who I believe is here in Singapore and was working at the Centre for Strategic Futures here over the summer.
Thanks, Josh. Actually, I think this question links quite nicely to what Piret was just talking about, because if I were creating things from scratch, and one thing I would focus on is training, right? And the kinds of capacities and instincts and habits of mind that we inculcate in public officers. And this question is a great one because it's all about skills. I can think of a few. The question mentions futures thinking, which I do think is important. Piret mentioned that several times in her presentation, and I agree completely that the kind of anticipatory instinct to plan for possible future scenarios, not predict the future, but plan for possibilities. That I think is a key skill, and it requires imagination. It requires drawing together different strands and different disciplines and thinking across sectors rather than within very specific silos. I think the approach of a designer is an important set of skills. Design thinking as a skill is an important thing because it allows us to focus very much on users and the problems and pain points that they face, rather than focus on the supply of what governments can provide. I think it is crucial that we focus on the needs of citizens and the needs of businesses and other stakeholders, rather than simply focus on what governments themselves can do. So those are two core things. I would add a couple of others, right? I think anthropology is going to be key. We've got lots of great skills out there in econometrics and quantitative disciplines. And those are important. We do need to understand aggregated data. But I don't think they tell a complete story. And we do need to have the ethnographers and the anthropologists out there who are also going through the deep understandings of the humanness of our societies. We need those sorts of skills in government today as well, because when we do that, we then complement the quantitative with the qualitative, which is a different kind of narrative, a different kind of data, but nonetheless, which is very, very important. Last two things which I think are going to be key. First thing is behavioral sciences, understanding that things can be achieved through the deep understanding of the psychology and human behavior that's at work. Things like nudges, things like creating architectures within which choices can be made, which are achieving the social good. And I think we've had lots of behavioral economists come to the fore in the last decade or so. We need those sorts of understandings to permeate policy and not simply be occurring at the fringes of the policy-making environment. And then the last thing is to understand the wealth that there is in data science and data analytics. We have so much more data today than we used to, and to do futures, to do good design thinking, to complement the qualitative work of the anthropologists, we need to be able to harness the quality of data and the potential that data provides us with, not just in a quantitative way, but to also use that data to actually provide rich insights into the human motivations in particular communities and the kinds of insights on what actions we can take to actually nudge and shape human behavior. If policymakers can achieve at least some of those, then I think we'll be in a much better place than we have been before. And I would stress, we don't need all of these things to reside in single persons, right? What we need is composite teams who have these different capabilities complementing each other, rather than trying to have one single hero who can do all of this work. We need the complementarities to come at the team level and the organizational level, so that the anthropologists, the historians, the behavioral scientists, the futurists, and the design thinkers are talking to each other and doing complex mixing work in the overall projects that they take care of.
Fantastic answer, thank you. And I've got a half follow-up, I suppose, to Otto, because you were talking about data analytics in particular, and data being one of the things we can use. That requires a large amount of tech. And I was reading, I think it was Wired magazine just the other week, that the F-35, the United States Joint Strike Fighter, the most advanced fighter plane known to man, has the same computer processing power as a small hybrid car, because that's how fast technology moves from the time it was developed to what it is that they've put in the sky today. How can you build an organization, especially in the military context perhaps, that can cope with the incredible pace of change and the complexities that brings?
Joshua, there's one thing that still today I don't understand, and that is the military by itself is very agile. When you think of troops in the field, they know how to deal with uncertainties, and with that complexity in the field, and they're pretty good at that. But when it comes to the military bureaucracy, it's a complete failure. And the other thing that strikes me is I've talked to so many people, from 4-star generals to simple soldiers. 99.9% will concur that it cannot continue the way it is doing right now. It cannot continue like this. It's a dysfunctional system. And with so many people in the system agreeing that it cannot continue, we still don't manage to change it. These are the two things I still haven't understood. Now, so is it possible to transform an organization like this? Absolutely, yes. We have to get away from the size question. Size is always the predominant question. We always take size as an excuse for not having a different culture. And that is plainly wrong. A good culture can be scaled. And I'll give you just one example. When I drill really deep why things are not entrepreneurial, why things are not innovative, I found 3 drivers. One is fear. People have the fear of doing the wrong thing. And it's not that the people are bad, they're just in a system in which, as Aaron pointed out, in which taking a risk does simply not pay off. The second driver is hybris. It's the overly self-confident. It's the other side. It's people who can it all, who have had the best training. Particularly in the military, we like to think that we invented leadership, so we must be the best in leadership. And it's this hybrid of having stopped in a way of learning from others, and particularly outside of the military. Yeah, we always say, "Oh, in the military, it's a question of life and death, so it's different." And this is very dangerous the moment you stop learning from others. And the third thing is manipulative behavior. It's amazing how many people can live in the public sector by being manipulative. And this is a human being, like Aaron said, behavioral science point of question. Now, these three things have nothing to do with scale. It has to do with attitude, how we collaborate with other human beings. So this is, I think this is what we ought to talk about. And I would even turn it around. Where, if not government, where, if not the military, could we live up to those standards? Because here it's not about profit making, it's about purpose. So if in an organization where it's all about purpose, we cannot achieve those basic human aspects of social sciences, of interaction with other human beings, where can we?
And well, let me follow up, but let me put this back to Aaron first. So we have tremendous complexity, and of course that needs new approaches and potentially innovation units like Otto's that are really shaking up the system and moving much faster. But in an overall government, we of course have bits that the marriage registry, for instance, I imagine they don't need to innovate all that much every day. And how do we lead and ensure that these different bits of government work together in an environment where there is such incredible complexity and change happening? What can we do to simplify that and to ensure that the rebels in the innovation units can work alongside those who actually want the stability and probably work best within the traditional siloed structures?
You know, Josh, that's a really good question. Although I'm not sure marriage units are the best example of people who don't have to innovate. I suspect they do, actually, because they are dealing with citizens every day, and they need to alter the nature of that experience. I mean, marriages in the time of COVID have had to take place virtually, right? And the kinds of innovations that involve, while making sure that authentication and the right identification happen, that the right people are marrying each other and the right Zoom accounts have actually called in, that's important as a kind of innovation. But I take your broader point that there are parts of governments that don't always need to change. And the way I try and think about this is to go back to the work of the great sociologist Everett Rogers, who wrote in the 1960s about the diffusion of innovation. You may have come across some of these ideas before, right? That innovation happens amongst 2.5% of the population, and then those ideas move to an early adopter group, which is about 13.5%, and then you have an early majority of 34% of the population. The next 34% are the late majority, and then the last 16% of this bell curve are what he called the laggards, right? The people who will not change their phones until the spare parts for those phones are no longer available, and they are then forced to find a new model. Now, he used this to understand product innovation, right? Saying that there would be innovation and then the product would diffuse across the population. That's why he called it diffusion of innovation. But I think this is actually a good way to understand any large and complex system. That any big system is going to have some innovators, some early adopters, some early majority, late majority, and some laggards. And it's important to understand that actually all of the parts of those systems are important. The early adopters are there because they help to provide support to the innovators and kind of be fellow travelers along the journey, right? In coming about with new ideas and implementing them. The one thing I don't agree with Everett Rogers on is the term laggards, because that suggests that the people who are resisting change are somehow, morally deficient, that they're not there to be team players, that they're blocking change simply for the sake of it. Sometimes there is good reason to not change. Some laggards, if they're taking care of building safety, for instance, our people who build roads, I probably don't want them innovating a huge amount, right? Or at least doing big experiments until they've really sorted out safety standards and the overall rigor of what they're trying to do. And I think that in those cases, therefore, there is a place for a certain amount of risk carefulness even if we're not dealing with the fear or the risk aversion that Otto talked about, because I do agree that excessive risk aversion can really be a problem for vibrancy in a system. But I like to think that all of those groups must coexist with each other, and that a complex system has them in healthy dialogue with one another, such that the innovators can sometimes learn what does and doesn't work about their ideas. They can then revisit them and refine them and improve them. And that the laggards or the stalwarts of a system can actually also sometimes be persuaded why new things might be worth taking up. But all of them are necessary for the system's overall health.
Yeah.
Please.
And I couldn't agree more with what Aran just said. And if we transpose this in an organizational question, I think what happens in most governments is they sort of understand that there are these perspectives and they're all important, but they try to create the consensus at the operational level. So you will have some people, who are the protectors, not to call them laggards, I agree, and you have the innovators, and senior leadership asks them to reach consensus on the project. And that's simply not going to work. I think that a better model would be to look at it at a portfolio kind of thing. So from a senior management point of view, you would allow certain projects to be innovative and go ahead and take certain risks, but you want to give them the independence to do that. You don't want to make them dependent on the protectors, and vice versa. You want to leave the protectors to certain operations, to certain business models, etc. They can keep a certain thing, and you don't want the innovators come in there all the time and pushing them to go faster. It's not going to work. So in real life, what that means is you have somebody called the IT security guy, the finance guy, the auditor guy, who will always sit in your project and will kill everything. And that's not the right operational model. So coming back to this agile idea of the cross-functional team, it's so important to have that expertise and to have that perspective, etc. But please include them in the project team and have an innovator in charge of the project team when you want to do innovation, and have a protector in charge of the protection team if you want to do protection, but don't mix the two.
Aaron or Piret, do you want to come in on that, or shall I follow up with another question? Okay, then Piret, did you want to?
Yeah, I think it's a very important point that Marcel and both Aaron have made, is that sometimes consensus cannot be reached. That when we're talking about radical innovation, then what we see in the private sector as well is that these ideas usually go outside of huge, big organizations, and then they build another company around these things. So they don't, that's why Canon failed. That's why we have big companies. We don't have the same companies always at the top 10 of market leads in industries. And that is exactly the kind of the ambidexterity problem, that you can't do the two things at the same time. And in the public sector, usually the problem is, where do I go? Like, if I'm not agreeing with the Ministry of Finance, is there an alternative Ministry of Finance that I can go and explore this idea? So you have to really think, like, what are the kind of funnels of these ideas, or these kind of radical transformation projects that need a little bit of time to actually permeate and become more mature. So the laggards, or in the end, after a few years, can actually, the case has already proven itself. Everybody knows it's working, and then they will jump on and do the same. And another idea that I wanted to comment on from Marcel was also about the military, which I find very, very curious, in a sense that we have an organization that is built for war and seems to function quite well during war situations. So when they're fighting in the field, it's fine. What they're not built for is peace. So when they're sitting in the bases and everything, like, the bureaucracy becomes nonsense. The command of control and all these procedures become very nonsensical. So also it raises a question about, if we are building specific organizations for very specific things that they can function in very specific circumstances, what will they do outside of those circumstances?
I have to answer to that. the purpose of the military is not to win the war, it's to win the peace. It's all about peace. And I think it's not a question of whether it works well at war but not in peace. I think it's the same problem as every big corporate. You have the organizational unit, the battalion that's doing the daily business, and you have headquarters. And the problem is headquarters. Yeah? We have bureaucratic headquarters, and the same in corporates and in the military. And I have met so many wonderful people, not only in the German military, also in Singapore military, all over Europe, in Israel, in the United States, everywhere. They're excellent leaders, they're excellent people, but bureaucracy is eating us up. And so I think it's important when we talk about the public sector, when we look critically on the public sector, it's not a problem that there are bad people. It's not a problem that are unprofessional people. It's not a problem that people are lacking purpose or ideas or anything. We've just created organizational dinosaurs that create an environment where it's very onerous to affect change, and where it costs them so much energy that it's only possible for outstanding people. Yeah.
Let's move on now from the dinosaurs to look to the future, because I think Aaron followed one of these things that I imagine is going to become a law of any public sector innovation gathering, which is but COVID. Every discussion eventually is going to say, but COVID means that this group now needs to innovate. COVID-19 obviously has changed a huge amount of what we have to do in government, but let's look to the future. Which bits of government do you think in particular are just going to totally change? And which bits of government would you really just want to use COVID-19 as an excuse to change as well? Are there any bugbears at the moment that you'd really just like to transform for good? Otto, let's go to you first, looking to the future. What would you like to change?
So I think the entire government needs to change. The entire public sector needs to change. There's not one area that is not dysfunctional. And that's the same in every country. My silver bullet, so to speak. I mean, if I had one wish, it has to do with teams. It has to do the way we are designing the senior leadership teams. And it seems to me also confirmed by what Aaron and Piret said. We are in this world of complexity. We need more proactive governments, or I would say more entrepreneurial mindseted governments. And I think if that's the need of the time, take more entrepreneurial people with entrepreneurial mindset in the senior management teams, because you can introduce all concepts. You can talk about all technologies. At the end of the day, an organization is influenced by the very senior leadership team, and this is where the change needs to happen.
Aaron, let's put that to you. If you could make one change, if you're world president for the day, you can make one change. What would it be?
I'm sorry, Josh, I can't think of only one, so I'm going to do a few if you keep them quick. The thing I'd love to keep changing is how we conduct meetings, and this sound like a really micro thing, but if we could really be more efficient about the way in which we use time and steward the energy of public organizations, so much more good could be done. And I think some of this is already changing, right? As you said, COVID-19 has forced us to not meet physically and realize that actually we may have been addicted to physical co-location in really unhealthy ways before. I don't think I've really had much in the way of this discussion, for instance, although I've never met Piret and Otto before, but I think we've got a great dynamic going, and we've done it online, partly because Josh is this complete Energizer bunny, right, and has brought us together in this wonderful way. But I think we can find ways to transcend physicality, and if we can do that for meetings, both within government and between government and stakeholders, imagine the kind of power that we would unleash by not requiring physical travel anymore. We would still need it for some things, right? We would need it where relational work is important. We would still need this for brainstorming, where we're not just sharing ideas, but actually coming up with common strategies. But we would be able to be so much more targeted about how we use our energy and attention if we are much more digital and discerning about where meetings can be online rather than physical. The second thing I would say is I think we need to use COVID-19 as well as the occurrence of Brexit and the elections of particular leaders in parts of the world to understand the importance of futures. Because I think we've realized now that when we say something can never happen or something will not happen, that's actually just us speaking from the deep biases and worldviews that we have. COVID-19 has shown us that our biases can be shunted aside. The occurrence of Brexit has shown us that our deep assumptions about the world might be wrong. And we need to realize that that is the world we live in. It's a world that requires agility. It's a world that requires anticipatory governance, as Piret pointed out. And we need far more emphasis on that rather than simplistic predictions about the world. And again, I think we're starting to move on that front. The third thing that I'll say very quickly is I think as we move into being more high-tech in certain situations, we don't have to lose the ability to be high-touch. We can be relational and empathetic in the whole process of using technology. And some of the examples from Singapore, for instance, are when people have wanted to go and visit parks during the COVID-19 situation, we've set up apps that have allowed them to check what's crowded and what's not crowded in different parts of the parks in Singapore. We've allowed for that to happen in terms of other places like malls, right? And we've allowed for basically the use of technology to create connections amongst people and create these high-touch interactions, even though people have had to be safe distancing and physically separated. And I think we can do that. We can challenge ourselves to not accept this simple binary that technology is impersonal, and if we are personal, we can't use digital tech. We can do both if we try and move beyond these simplistic binaries, and I think COVID has helped us to really see that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aaron. Piret, let me put that to you. If you could make one change, or maybe you want to pick just a couple of changes today, what would they be?
Well, I mean, the fun thing is that governments are going to change if you want it or not. So that's why I very much agree with Aaron, is that we are going to live in a digital society, and if governments want it or not, it's going to come. And most of the hierarchy that Otto was talking about is going to be cut down because we don't need it anymore. And then the question is, what are we going to do with that resource and time? And I would like that resource and time to be, well, not to be spent into, we're going to spend a lot of time and effort because technology is going to force us into the digitalization and data analytics and predictive analytics and all these wonderful times. But the other arm of government that you should be actually building up, what Mariam was also talking about, is like spend the time talking to people. Like, why do you need to have a big data model to tell you what a social worker on a street could have told you in 5 seconds in terms of the kind of the complex issues that people are facing on the ground? So it's going to free up a lot of resources. Now, it's not just to call it a savings and let's get rid of those resources, but use that time and those resources on the ground for the benefit of citizens to actually get better outcomes for them, that we haven't really, solved problems that we haven't been able to solve in ages. Well, we have time and resources now. Let's go for it.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you, all of you, for making the time to join me today. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure meeting you.
That is the last session for the GovInsider Live Festival of Innovation. Please, from tomorrow, go to govinsider.live/watch, and you will be able to see all of the videos and fantastic conversations that you've missed, or go to govinsider.asia and read up some of the stories, the interviews, and the inspiration for this series as well. A huge thank you to the fantastic team at GovInsider who've worked tirelessly over the past month to really pull this together in a pandemic and try and build something new that inspires you. We really appreciate everyone who's watched us, everyone who's participated. Thank you very much. And finally, we hope you'll join us next year in April 2021 for the GovInsider Experience. This summit will be set in the year 2030 on a Singaporean space station on the moon. We'll be looking down at Earth and considering the tech trends and changes that have taken us to this point in the future. That's all I'm going to tell you for now. That's all I'm going to say for now. But thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again soon.